Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a stone-walled convent somewhere in 12th century France. You're wrapped in wool, scratchy, sure, but warm, and as you pass through the cloister, your breath curls in the cold morning air. You slip through a wooden door into the scriptorium, the writing room, and are immediately struck by the hush. It's not empty, far from it. Nuns sit hunched at long wooden desks, their heads bent low, their fingers moving steadily, and the only thing you can hear is the rhythmic scratching of goose quills across parchment. It's the soft sound of history being copied slowly, line by line. You sit down at an empty desk. In front of you, a fresh piece of vellum, creamy and faintly translucent. Beside it, a sharpened goose feather. You pick it up and twirl it in your fingers. It feels odd, light, yet purposeful. You don't yet realize that this simple tool is part of a centuries-long obsession, one that frankly you probably wouldn't survive. Between the ink spills, the calluses, and the nigh military discipline of convent life, your modern comforts would crumble faster than a stale communion wafer. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history show traveled. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink as a nun. Sister Beatrix, she says with a faint smile, slides into the seat next to you. Her hands are ink-stained, her sleeves rolled, her breath faintly minty. She offers you a small jar of ink and nods at your quill. Best not waste the daylight, she says, though it's mostly cloudy in here. You dip your quill, it scratches a bit. You press too hard. The tip splits. Beatrix winces. New feather? She asks. You nod sheepishly. They always need taming, she murmurs, and gently shows you how to angle the shaft. You're surprised to learn that each quill is like a violin bow, unique, temperamental, and needing just the right pressure. Goose quills, she tells you, are ideal because their feathers are both sturdy and supple. Swan feathers are too thick, crow feathers too small. Turkey, don't make her laugh, no geese, particularly from northern flocks, offer the perfect balance. Their wing feathers have a natural curve that guides the nib gracefully across a page. It's part science, part divine design, she says, with the faintest wink. You practice. Slowly the scratching sound settles into a rhythm. Light pressure, angle just so, dip, wipe, stroke. You glance around. Every nun here is doing the same thing. Heads down, elbows tucked, quills moving like tiny metronomes. It's peaceful, meditative, but it's also the backbone of the entire convent's purpose. Many people assume nuns spent most of their time praying, and yes, they prayed a lot, like a lot. But what often gets left out of textbooks is how much of their daily life was devoted to literacy. Unlike most women of the medieval world, nuns could read and, more importantly, write, and not just religious texts either. This convent, like many, doubled as a scriptorium and a small library. Literacy was a form of devotion, yes, but it was also a kind of quiet rebellion, a way to be heard in a world where women's voices were mostly ignored. Historians still argue whether these scriptoriums were hubs of power or prisons of conformity. But you're here now, and it feels like restrictive in its rules, freeing in its purpose. Beatrix leans closer. Did you know Sister Joan uses badger bristles to clean her nib? She whispers, claims it gives her better lines. I think it's just an excuse to keep a badger hairbrush. You chuckle, but make a note to try it later. The candle next to you sputters, and you suddenly realize how dark it's gotten. Outside, the day barely shifts from grey to greyer. These nuns, you learn, write in all conditions. Cold? Use gloves with the fingertips cut off. Dim light? Angle your parchment toward the flame. Hungry? Too bad it's a fast day. Still, there's a kind of camaraderie here. When one nun finishes a particularly long passage, the others offer soft smiles. If someone sneezes too loudly, a ripple of gentle laughter moves across the room. No one talks politics, no one talks romance, but everyone shares ink. You glance again at your goose quill, now smoother in your hand. There's a faint curve where your fingers rest, and a dot of ink drying near the top of the shaft. It's no longer pristine, it's yours, and you're starting to see the magic of it. The intimacy of crafting something slowly, line by line in silence. There's power here, not loud, not flashy, just quietly, insistently present. A nun near the window finishes her page. She holds it up to the light and nods in satisfaction. Then she begins again. So do you. You're starting to feel the rhythm now. The slow scratch, the careful dip, the faint tang of iron gall ink rising with the candle smoke. Sister Beatrix has returned to her own page, murmuring something that might be Latin, might be sleep deprivation. You try to keep your wrist loose, as she instructed. Too tight, and the lines jerk. Too loose, and your letters look like drunken fish. Writing, it turns out, is a full body exercise. You pause for a moment, glancing down at your quill. That curve, it's not just decorative, it's functional. The feather's natural arch helps balance the tool in your hand. Goose feathers were preferred because of that very structure. Specifically, the outer wing feathers of the left wing were prized by right-handed writers, and vice versa. The curvature aligns with your grip, offering flow and control. Who knew your feather came with a side of geometry? But you're not the only one admiring your tools. Sister Theodora down the row is carefully sorting through a bundle of new quills, inspecting each one like a jeweler might appraise sapphires. She even sniffs one. You don't ask why. It's probably a Theodora thing. She sets aside the fattest, most elegantly curved one, and gives it a small nod of approval. The rest are returned to a cloth pouch, bound with twine and marked inferior birds. You're starting to realize this isn't just writing, it's a craft, a reverent one. Every quill is hand-picked, every shaft cured and cut with precision. There's a quiet pride in choosing the right feather plucked from the right part of the goose, during the right season, ideally from a bird that didn't struggle too much. Apparently disgruntled geese make scratchier pets. You file that away. The scriptorium has its hierarchy, and senior nuns tend to get the first pick of fresh feathers. If you're lucky, you get second cut, usable but not glorious. If you're unlucky, you're handed a warped feather that writes like it's drunk and bitter about it. You remember what Beatrix told you earlier. A good quill hums. You don't hear it but you feel it, and she was right. When your feather glides just right, there's something musical about the motion, like a whispered chord under your finger. Historians still debate how standardized these tools really were. Did each convent have its own style of sharpening, its own quill-choosing rituals, or did everyone just do what Sister Beatrix does, mutter prayers while cutting the nib and hope the ink gods are in a good mood? You catch a whiff of beeswax from a freshly polished candle holder. It mixes with the faint goosey scent of the new quills, the earthy ink, and the ghost of baked bread from the convent kitchen. Sensory overload, but in a soft focus kind of way. And it's not just about the quill, the tools surrounding them. The knife used to shape the nib, the tiny whetstone for touch-ups, the sand for drying ink, all have their place. Everything's arranged like a ritual, a sacred desktop ecosystem. One quirk you notice, each nun personalizes her tool. Sister Beatrix's knife has a carved rose in the hilt. Sister Theodora ties a blue ribbon around her inkwell every Tuesday to remind the ink not to sulk, she claims. Another nun scratches a tiny fish into every quill shaft before using it, a symbol of or maybe just a reminder of dinner. No one's sure. Even the act of discarding a quill feels ceremonial. You watch as one nun gently places a split feather into a wooden box marked Worn Saints. She gives it a soft tap, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. You peek inside. Dozens of discarded quills lie nestled like dry bones. Some are stained, some snapped. All were once part of this great, quiet machinery of words. And here's the thing you're starting to understand. In an age when few people could write, these feathers weren't just tools. They were symbols of access, of education, of control over one's voice. In a world where most women were expected to stay silent, the quill offered speech, carefully inked, meticulously preserved, and utterly under the radar. You lean back, stretching your cramping finger. Through a narrow stained glass window, you spot a few actual geese waddling near the garden. One honks loudly and flaps its wings as if to say, "You're welcome, literate human." You consider saying thank you, but Sister Beatrix would probably give you a look. Still, there's something poetic about the whole thing. Geese, creatures most associated with messy farmyards and aggressive hissing, played an essential role in the transmission of human knowledge for centuries. Imagine being the librarian at the edge of the world, and your best assistant is a moderately angry bird. The candle beside you flickers again. You reach for a fresh sheet of parchment, your fingers moving with a little more confidence now. Your quill, your odd little tool from a goose's wing, dips once more into the inkwell, and you begin again. You're part of the rhythm now. Scratch, dip, breathe, repeat. Your hand has just started to settle into that familiar rhythm. Quill, dip, stroke. When Sister Beatrix nudges your elbow gently, she motions toward a wooden bench tucked against the wall, where a fresh bundle of feathers lies like a tangled halo. "We're preparing new quills today," she murmurs. "Time to learn the real art." You follow her over, eyeing the pile of goose feathers like a nervous baker approaching a pile of flour with no recipe. Most are white, a few tinged with grey, and they all seem to have a faintly oily sheen. It's not just about finding the prettiest one, it's about finding one that will survive days, sometimes weeks of scratching across parchment without exploding like a paper grenade. Beatrix picks one up with practiced ease. First we cure them, she said. Fresh feathers are too soft, wobbly, like overcooked noodles, she chuckles. Not that we get noodles often. She hands you a pot. These were soaked in water last night. Now we temper them, and tempering, you quickly learn, involves heat. Not too much, you're not roasting a chicken here, just enough warmth to harden the shaft. Beatrix places a few damp feathers near the fire. You watch as the steam curls up from them like they're sighing. Some convents, she explains, used ashes or even hot sand for this step. Others favored drying feathers above warm coals. There's no universal technique, and historians still argue over which method created the sharpest, most durable quills. Some say dry curing gave better results, others claim boiled and baked was best. The consensus? As usual, it depends. Once the feathers are warm and pliable, the cutting begins. Sister Beatrix draws a short, wicked-looking knife from her belt. Pen knife, she says. Yes, the original kind. You blink. Oh, that's where the name comes from. She lays the feather flat on a wooden board and begins to slice. Not too deep. She's shaping the nib now, the very tip that will touch the page. There's an angled cut first, then a few precise notches. She holds it up to the light, inspects the slit at the center and nods. It must breathe, she says. Ink flows better with a good split. You're handed your own knife. It feels weirdly ceremonial. You glance down at your chosen feather, then at Beatrix. Go on, she says. Worst case, you waste a goose's legacy. No pressure. You make the first cut. It's crooked. The second one goes too deep. The slit ends up a gaping chasm instead of a neat little breath hole. Beatrix winces, but pats your shoulder. First goose is always a disaster, she says. You try again. This one's better. Not perfect, but usable. The next one's even smoother, and then you get to strip the barbs. Not everyone does this, but Beatrix insists it's good for the soul. You gently peel away some of the lower veins of the feather, leaving just the shaft bare where your fingers will hold it. This also keeps the quill from feeling too fluffy, which apparently annoys most scribes after the 5th hour of writing. You can save the stripped barbs to stuff pillows, Theodora chimes in, strolling by. That way the goose gets to poke you twice. That counts as joke number 1. You begin to notice the personality of each feather. Some cut easily, some bend like they're shy. One particularly stubborn specimen cracks in two the moment you touch it. Beatrix sighs. That one had drama in its bone. Preparing quills isn't a daily task, it's more like a weekly ritual. When a new batch is ready, the convent gathers them like tiny relics. Some are bundled for trade with nearby others are saved for special texts, illuminated manuscripts, psalters, and once, Theodora says with a grin, a wedding sermon that no one ever used. Bit awkward that. You glance around the work table. It's covered in feathers, shavings, tiny curls of cut. There's a warm earthy smell in the air, part firewood, part goose oil, part ink. It's oddly comforting. By now your second feather is done. You ink it lightly and try a few practice strokes on a scrap of parchment. It feels smoother, cleaner. The nib gives just the right amount of resistance. The ink flows like syrup down a cool plate. Beatrix nods. That'll do. You've got a good hand. Loose enough to dance, tight enough to spell. You don't quite know what that means, but you beam anyway. One of the younger nuns, Sister Magda, holds up her feather with pride. It's too short, slightly frayed, and obviously cut at a slant, but she's beaming like she just wrote a new gospel. Everyone applauds softly. Here even the smallest successes matter, even if the end result is a goose nib that looks like it survived a duel. There's a quiet joke passed among the sisters. When the goose quills are gone, so is the convent's voice. It's funny, but it's also true. Without their writing tools, these women would be silent. No correspondence with bishops, no copied texts, no records, no recipes, no illuminated borders with tiny frogs playing harps. So yes, the obsession is real. The nuns care deeply, fiercely about their feathers, not because they're fancy, but because they're essential. You wrap your finished quill in a strip of cloth and tuck it beside your parchment, right where it belongs. It's not much, but it's yours. A quiet victory in a quiet war to keep knowledge alive. Later that afternoon, the scriptorium settles into a rare hush, even more hushed than usual. Sister Theodora, who usually hums badly off-key while writing, has gone silent. Beatrix's usual tusk of disapproval is replaced by a gentle scratch of her quill. You glance up from your manuscript and realize why. It's inspection day. Twice a month,
The abbess herself glides in to check on the progress of the copying work, and more importantly, to make sure the sacred texts remain unblemished by error, sass, or geese-related doodles. You sit up a little straighter, smoothing the edge of your parchment, careful not to smear the ink. Nothing ruins your self-confidence faster than the abbess catching a typo in your The abbess herself is a tall, stern woman who somehow manages to move silently despite the fact that her robes are lined with what must be 3 miles of wool. She walks slowly between the desks, hands clasped, eyes sharp. She doesn't say much, but her raised eyebrow can reduce a grown nun to a puddle. You glance at your own text. It looks decent, not perfect, but the letters are uniform, the spacing even, and the ink didn't bleed like it did yesterday when you sneezed mid-sentence. Still, your heart thuds as she pauses behind you. A long moment passes. You brace for impact. She leans in, her finger hovering just above your line. Your descenders are drifting south, she murmurs. Your what now? Your geese, peas and yours, they're drooping. Oh, you whisper. I'll fix them. She nods once, then glides on. You exhale like you've just survived a duel. Sister Beatrix shoots you a thumbs up behind her ink pot. This is the nun equivalent of a confetti cannon. But the inspection isn't just about accuracy. The abbess also checks quill maintenance, because believe it or not, a dull nib can be a spiritual problem. A bad quill leads to ugly letters lead to confusion in the text. Confusion leads to misinterpretation, and before you know it, someone's convinced that Christ had a twin brother named Greg. So mid-inspection, you all perform the silent communal sharpening ritual. You take out your penknife and gently shave the tip of your quill against a tiny worn block of stone. The shavings fall like soft curls. The abbess watches closely, nodding when the nib gleams just right. It's during this ritual that you realize the true depth of the obsession. These aren't just writing tools, they're precision instruments. Each nun has a slightly different style. Some keep their nibs long and sharp for elegant italics. Others prefer broad, flat ends for bold Gothic letters. Historians still argue about how standardized these styles really were across different convents. Some believe there was strict adherence to regional script styles, while others suggest there was more wiggle room, especially in more isolated communities. In truth, it probably depended on who was teaching and whether they had a flair for drama. Beatrix, for instance, insists on a flourished hand. She adds tiny loops to her ascenders and dots her eyes like she's planting roses. Theodora's writing, meanwhile, looks like it was carved with a ruler and a grudge. Precise, blocky, no nonsense. And then there's you, hovering somewhere in between, trying not to let your F look like a medieval saxophone. As the abbess moves on, the scriptorium exhales as one tension dissolves. The humming resumes, faintly off-key. Quills resume their careful dance. Then someone sneezes. Theodora shrieks dramatically and leaps backward. Ink splash, she wails. You all rush over to assess the damage. One glorious line of Psalms now bears a starburst of black ink where a single droplet exploded across the page. The abbess returns, sighs and simply says again, and so Theodora starts anew, grumbling about curses and nasal sabotage. You offer her a fresh quill, one of your recent creations, and she eyes it skeptically. This better not be from the same Goose as last time. You assure her it isn't. It is. Moments like this are strangely unifying. The work is tedious, yes, but there's camaraderie and shared suffering over ink blots. Shared pride over crisp, clean pages. Shared glee when someone manages a perfect illuminated capital letter without the ink bleeding like a moody teenager's journal. There's even a touch of competition. Sister Agnes once claimed she copied an entire book of hours without needing to recut her quill. The rest of you suspect she's lying, but in a convent that's a spicy accusation. After the inspection, the abbess leaves behind a small parcel. Fresh parchment, and tucked neatly beneath it, a cloth-wrapped bundle of new feathers. Everyone crowds around like children on market day. You each get to pick one. You choose yours carefully, long, pale, slightly curved. It feels like the feather has chosen you, not the other way around. You bring it back to your desk, already imagining the shape of its nib, the letters it might write, and in that moment you get it. You understand why the nuns are obsessed, not because the quills are beautiful, but because they are the bridge between thought and permanence. A whisper becomes a stroke, a prayer becomes a page, a fleeting moment becomes something that lasts. Even if it started in the wing of a goose. Later that week you find yourself elbow deep in a different sort of task, cataloguing old quills. Yes, even retired quills get special treatment here. Sister Marguerite oversees the archive, a dim, cool room lined with wooden drawers and vellum-wrapped bundles, labeled in the fussy script of nuns long gone. Some drawers contain manuscripts, others, just the worn-out stumps of goose feathers bundled like sacred relics. You look at her, puzzled. Why are we saving broken quills? She doesn't blink, because each one served a purpose. Marguerite picks up a short, splintered quill, with a chewed-up nib. This one copied the sermons of Father Ulrich during the Great Rain. The ink smudged on every page, but the quill held up, barely. You blink. The Great Rain, she nods. 17 days of it. Everything was damp, even our tempers. You find another quill, this one with an oddly curved shaft and a faint pink stain at its base. Strawberry ink accident, Marguerite says with a smirk. Don't and so you begin to catalogue them. The labels are brief but poetic, used for the illumination of Ezekiel, wrote Sister Heloise's last letter, failed on Psalm 22 line 3. You find yourself handling each one gently, like an old friend who once knew your secret. Over time you notice a curious detail. The best quills, the ones that wrote smoothest, lasted longest, weren't always the prettiest. Some were uneven, mismatched, even discolored. Marguerite taps her nose knowingly. It's about balance. Soft enough to flow, stiff enough to bite the page. She pauses. Bit like us really. That earns a soft laugh. That's your second joke for the section. You also learn that the nuns had favorites, not just types of quills, but specific geese. Certain convents kept small flocks, raising them with as much care as one might tend a library. Some nuns even named their geese, Lady Featherstone, Sir Hiss, Captain Downsworth. Historians still debate whether these stories are exaggerated. Some claim they're romanticized inventions from later monastic texts. Others point to marginal notes, tiny scribbled comments in the corners of manuscripts, that suggest geese were indeed honored companions in the scribal life. One note reads, "Feather from Helena, may her molting be blessed." You kind of hope that one was real. Of course, not all geese were cooperative. One tale, often retold by Sister Theodora with dramatic flair, involves a particularly violent gander named Gregory, who chased a visiting abbot clean across the cloister garden. He was just protecting his quills, she says. As you sort through the collection, you begin to appreciate the subtle variations in feather structure. Goose feathers from colder regions tend to be denser and more rigid, ideal for long-form texts like Bibles or legal scroll. Feathers from younger birds might be softer, good for delicate annotation, or shorter pieces. Some convents even experimented with swan or crow feathers, though goose remained the gold standard. There's also the matter of handedness. You pause at one oddly curved quill. Marguerite raises an eyebrow. Left-handed, she says. Wait, left-handed nuns. She nods. We didn't advertise it. Turns out, left-handed scribes had to learn creative angles or modify their desk. In some places they were forced to use their right hands, which led to heartbreakingly slow writing and occasionally, as the scribes would whisper, divinely crooked letters. There's still debate among scholars about how left-handed nuns were treated. Some argue they were simply retrained. Others say that certain convents quietly accommodated them, crafting curved nibs, or offering angled inkwells. What's certain is that when you hold one of these curved quills in your hand, it feels like an act of quiet rebellion. After an hour or so, Marguerite brings out a tiny wooden box. Inside are a handful of specials. These are the truly odd ones. A feather dyed blue from accidental contact with lapis pigment, a quill so finely sharpened it could pass for a needle, and one that's been wrapped in thin parchment as if wearing a little cloak. That one, she says, was Sister Constant. She had arthritic fingers, wrapped it so she could grip. You stare down at the delicate wrapping, marveling at how personal a tool can become. It's not just a feather, it's a conduit for intention, prayer, memory. It's around this time you realize how many layers this obsession. It's practical, yes, but also emotional. Quills are part of identity here, part of legacy, and in a world where women's voices often get drowned out, a sharp nib and a full inkwell are subtle forms of resistance. Before you leave the archive, Marguerite offers you a small bundle tied with red thread. Old stock, she says. May the geese be kind to you. You tuck it into your habit, feeling a strange sense of gratitude toward creatures you've only ever seen hissing in muddy ponds. Here they've been elevated, feather by feather, into something almost sacred. You're back in the scriptorium the next morning, a fresh goose feather in hand, the tip unsharpened, the shaft pale as milk. It's a blank slate like the day itself. The inkwell glistens under a shaft of light streaming through the high glassless window, cold air whistling through, smelling of stone, damp wool and candle soot. You roll the feather between your fingers, debating the angle of your first cut. This is a slow, delicate process, not something you rush. The wrong slice, and your nib splits too wide, too shallow, and it won't deliver ink properly. You're not just trimming, you're sculpting a sliver of bird into a tool that will, if you do this right, speak Latin. There's a calm to a rhythm, one slice to bevel the edge, one to shape the point. You carve the slit down the center of the nib, feeling resistance give way to a satisfying snap. That's the sweet spot, the moment where feather becomes quill making is not glamorous, but it is oddly meditative, if you don't mind the occasional goose aftertaste. The shaft sometimes needs to be scraped of oily residue, which even after drying can emit a faint barnyard scent. A minor nuisance, unless you're Beatrix, who insists on perfuming hers with crushed lavender, for holiness, she says. And also historians still argue whether quill scenting was actually practiced, or whether it's just convent folklore passed down through centuries of dramatic retellings, but the idea of nuns adding rose water or myrrh to their tools isn't far-fetched. These were women after all, who wove incense into their lives as prayer. Once sharpened, you test your nib on a scrap of vellum, a single letter, then a word. The ink flows well, thick, but obedient. You smile, just a little, then comes the moment of choice, what to write. Today's assignment is a series of marginalia, little notes and references, written in the edges of a larger manuscript. These aren't full texts, but quiet, helpful additions, corrections, clarifications, sometimes just little prayers or personal thoughts. It's where nuns sneak in a bit of themselves, side by side with scripture. You begin with a simple note next to a confusing passage in the Psalms, a line about floods and mercy. You translate the Latin for clarity, keeping your strokes small. Then you add a tiny drawing of a boat, just a curve and a line, nothing fancy, but it feels like a wink to anyone who will read it later. That's the unspoken joy of marginalia. These tiny additions feel like whispers across time. One famous example you've all heard about came from a nun who drew tiny nuns, climbing vines in the margins of a Bible. Another supposedly hid a tiny goose, wearing a bishop's mitre in the corner of a page. No one knows why, but it's hilarious and comforting. You wonder, was she bored? Was she tired of copying Begat for the 50th time and decided to bless future readers with a dose of whimsy? There's a strange power in it. These women, cloistered and largely anonymous, left behind flourishes that make scholars chuckle hundreds of years later. Not bad for someone using bird parts and soot. Across the room, Sister Theodora lets out a low groan. She's been trying to fix a page of errant spacing, but her quill keeps catching on the vellum. You offer your fresh one. She inspects it like a surgeon examining borrowed forceps. This feels competent, she says. I'll take it.
She takes another feather, not sharpened for writing but left intact. The soft down at the base still fluffs outward like a halo. She gently uses the feather to dust excess gold from the letter, brushing it away with quiet reverence. You stare. Did you just make that goose feather holy? Obviously. And you realize, not every quill is destined to write. Some are for cleaning, some are for ornamentation, some are made into fans or bookmarks. In this convent, a feather has about as many second lives as a cat. There's even a rumor going around that Sister Agnes has been weaving trimmed nibs into her embroidery. For protection, she says. From what? Mistakes. You return to your desk, now in possession of a new idea, a marginal goose in your next manuscript, just subtle enough to go unnoticed by the abbess, but obvious enough for the next nun who finds it. It's not mischief, it's tradition. You dip your quill once more and begin a small note in the margin. The Latin glides across the vellum like a boat across still water, and beside it you draw the simplest goose imaginable. 2 loops, a beak, no more than a feather's width. It's silly, but it's yours. Time flows differently in the convent. Some days feel like they stretch across centuries, like the parchment you're scraping, line by line. Others pass in a blink, lost to the rhythm of ink and breath, and the steady scratching of quills against vellum. But today feels in between, not quite fast, not quite slow, just suspended. You're assigned to help with the index table, a glorified filing system tucked in the back of the library. It's a haphazard stack of book inventories, author lists, and mysterious diagrams that may or may not be someone's idea of a joke. You find one labeled the Order of Disobedient Saints, which turns out to be about dietary restrictions. Your job: clean it up, organize it, and of course copy it into legible order using a fresh quill, and that's when you hit a problem. Feather politics. You arrive at the tool bench and find that someone has taken all the medium-weight goose feathers, the good ones, the all-rounders, not too floppy, not too stiff. All that's left are either giant clumsy plumes or brittle little wing feathers that splinter like kindling. You saw Sister Bruna again. She's notorious for hoarding the best supplies and labeling them with tiny faded initials like she's branding livestock. You're tempted to reclaim one, but Bruna's sharp, and her memory's sharper. Last time someone borrowed one of her bee feathers, she posted a haiku on the bulletin board. Stolen feather rights, but steals grace from sisterhood. May your ink run dry. Cold. Very cold. So you improvise. You choose a slightly awkward feather, a bit too curved, but it's got potential. You trim it, you test it, and you adjust. By the third try it glides well enough to pass inspection. You start rewriting the index entries, slowly falling into the trance-like pace that only copying can bring. The letter forms become meditative, each A a tiny dome, each G a sleeping snail. But here's where it gets interesting. As you sift through the old entries, you find something odd, a set of abbreviations you can't decipher. Not Latin, not Greek, just strange symbols mixed with numbers, like shorthand, but off. You ask Sister Marguerite, who takes one look and laughs quietly. Ah, that's Hildegard's code. Hildegard was a nun from 3 generations back, who apparently liked to invent systems, music systems, calendar systems, feather rating systems. Wait, feather rating systems? Oh yes, Marguerite's. She rated each quill she used and recorded it in the margins, had her own scale 1 to 5 feathers depending on balance, grip and personality. You blink, personality. She swore some feathers were mood. You flip to one of her old manuscripts, and sure enough in the bottom corner there's a tiny rating box. Feather Gustavia, mood, stubborn, score 3.5 feathers. Historians still argue whether Hildegard was serious or delightfully unhinged. Some suggest her system had real value in feather analysis. Others think she was just keeping herself entertained during long winters of copying Leviticus. Either way, you start noticing the small things she logged, how a feather handled damp ink, how it responded to midday heat, how it fared under pressure from late-night copying sessions. You feel a weird kinship with her, a woman who turned even her pen into a subject of study. And as you're sorting through her notes, you find a sheet slipped between 2 pages. My top 5 quills of the year. It reads like a bizarre yearbook page. Sir Crispington, ideal flexibility, smelled faintly of rosemary. Miss him. Long Gerald, too wobbly but loyal, best under moonlight. Vera Sharp, aggressive, excellent for writing rebukes. The Whisperer, near silent, gave perfect angles, broke tragically mid of Maria. Bernard, underrated, ugly, reliable, still in use. You laugh. You can't help it. It's absurd and somehow beautiful. This is someone who lived with these feathers, saw them as tools, as company, even as little personalities stitched into her daily life. Inspired, you start keeping notes of your own. Not a full rating system, not yet, but little observations. Slippery grip. Nose tickles from death. Writes best after lunch. Nothing fancy, just enough to feel like you're part of a long feathery lineage. Later that afternoon, you and Sister Beatrix are tasked with trimming new feathers. She shows you a trick with heating the quill slightly over a candle flame. It hardens the shaft, makes it last longer, she says. Too much heat though, and it curls like bad cheese. You ask if she's ever named hers. She shrugs. Once, Reginald. Didn't end well, got stepped on during Vespers. Poor Reginald. The two of you fall into quiet work. The only sounds are the crackle of flame, the gentle scrape of knives, and the soft rustle of discarded bits of feather hitting the floor like dry snow. You think about Hildegard, rating her quills. You think about Sir Crispington and Bern. You think about how absurd it is that you now know the difference between a feather that's too bouncy and one that's emotionally distant. And yet, it matters. Every detail, every odd code, every personality quirk, every scratchy nib. It all builds towards something greater, a manuscript that might outlast your own name, a moment of clarity for someone reading it a century from now. All from a goose, all from this quiet obsession with the perfect pen. So there you are, knees tucked under the long oak table in the coldest wing of the convent. It's a copy day, again, but today there's a different energy in the air. Sister Theodora is muttering Latin under her breath like a spell gone sideways, and someone in the corner is sneezing repeatedly, probably Sister Agnes, who insists on writing barefoot to feel closer to the parchment. But that's not why today feels different. Today is Goose Quill Inspection Day. Yes, it's a thing. Once every month, the abbess makes her solemn rounds, checking the condition of your quills, like a stern librarian checking for dog-eared pages. Too splintered, into the scrap pile. Too floppy, out you go.
The horror of horrors, ink splotches on the feather. That gets you a lecture about purity of tools reflecting purity of heart. You're not exactly scared, just nervous. You have 5 quills laid out like a surgeon prepping for Goose-based open heart surgery, each sharpened to a different width, labeled with waxed linen tags you braided yourself. You even polished the shafts with a rag, partly for aesthetics, partly to erase the ink stain from when you sneezed mid-copy. You glance at Sister Beatrix's line. Of course hers look like the inside of a royal stationery box. One even has gold thread wrapped at the base. You raise an eyebrow. For grip, she says, and also to intimidate Sister Bruna. Sensible. The abbess finally arrives, small, owl-eyed, and terrifyingly silent. She inspects each feather with the intensity of a jeweler checking for counterfeit diamonds. One of your quills she holds up to the light, examining the slit in the nib like it holds the secrets of heaven. Acceptable, she says. You could swear it's almost a compliment. Then she pauses at your newest one, the slightly bent feather from yesterday. You prepare for impact. But instead she gives a small nod. Curved but clever. You've learned to adapt. It's silly how proud you feel. But in the convent moments of praise are as rare as warm bathwater. You slide back to your bench and dip that very quill into your favorite ink, oak gall, dark and smooth, the color of ancient shadow. You resume copying a long passage from Augustine, but as your wrist moves your thoughts wander, tracing the long legacy of writing tools. Historians still argue whether the medieval nuns were responsible for specific innovations in quill design, or if they simply perfected the maintenance of what monks had standardized. But here's the thing. No one babied their quills quite like the women in cloister. Take Sister Editha for example, now long gone to the heavenly scriptorium but still gossiped about with fondness. She reportedly used beeswax on the tips of her quills overnight, claiming it coaxed the spirit of clarity into the ink. Did it work? Unclear. Did it smell amazing? Yeah. Then there's the double quill controversy. A few illuminated manuscripts from the late 12th century show evidence of 2 writing styles in the same hand, almost as if someone was using 2 quills at once, switching mid-word. Scholars speculate it could have been a method to speed things up, or to shift between ink types. Some even suggest it was the result of a single overachieving nun refusing to waste a second on redipping. You try this once, just to see. It's a disaster. Ink everywhere. One feather in your total chaos. You quietly vow never to multitask again. The day goes on, the sun casting long shadows through the narrow windows, and you keep copying, your hand steady and mind floating. At midday, Sister Marguerite pauses in her own work and pulls out a relic, an old feather encased in glass, supposedly the last quill used by Sister Aurelia, who copied the entire book of Genesis without a single error. It's pale and delicate, the nib worn to a soft arc. You stare at it for a long time. This is the strange immortality of a convent quill, not just in the words it writes, but in how it's remembered, named, admired, treasured, the most mundane object, elevated to legacy. You glance at your own half-used feathers, lying like pale bones on the table, and wonder if they'll be remembered too, maybe not with glass cases or hymns, but perhaps with a smile or a whispered memory passed on during candle hour. Did you know she used to talk to her feathers? Someone might say in 100 years, gave them names like pets. It's not a bad way to be remembered. The abbess returns at the end of the day, this time with a scroll in hand. New commission, she announces. A bishop wants his psalter redone. Collective groans rise like incense. Another psalter means hundreds of pages of script and margin notes, and exacting illuminated initials. But here's the kicker. He specifically requested nuns for the time. He says he prefers the handwriting. The abbess adds, with a glimmer of smugness, says ours is neater. There's a moment of silence and then Sister Theodora lets out a triumphant snort. Take that, monks. Because despite the aches in your wrist, the perpetual ink under your fingernails, and the feather shavings that seem to follow you like breadcrumbs, there's something deeply satisfying in knowing your work is sought after. Not flashy, not famous, but precise, thoughtful, quietly excellent. You look down at your quill, now softened from use, nib dulled at the tip. It'll need reshaping soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe after the evening prayers. For now, you dip it one more time and press it to the vellum. The ink flows, the words form, you write, and the feather remember. Evening has its own sound in the convent, the hush that falls after vespers, the soft creak of wooden floorboards as sisters shuffle back to their cells, the occasional groan from an old bench finally getting to sit down for the night. It's the time of day when thoughts stretch out and time itself begins to loosen its grip, like laces before bed. You've finished your copying quota for the day, your eyes a little watery from squinting, your fingers stained and stiff, but your mind strangely alert. There's something about Twilight that turns even the most mundane questions into mysteries, like this one. Why is Sister Lucia collecting feathers from the geese herself? Most of the sisters wait for the seasonal pluckings, when feathers are cleaned, sorted, and laid out like harvest goods. But not Lucia. She's out there at dusk, trailing behind a half-dozen geese like some sort of feather-fixated shepherdess. You ask her about it, half teasing, expecting a vague reply about connecting to the source or some other ascetic line, but she surprises you. Goose temperament matters, she says plainly. Happy geese give better quills. You wait for the punchline, there isn't one. She goes on to explain, completely serious, that the calmest geese tend to have smoother primary feathers with less curvature. Angry or anxious geese, their feathers often have warping or minute stress bends along the shaft, and it makes sense in a way. After all, the feather is a living thing before it becomes a tool. Maybe it holds a memory of its host. Historians still argue whether this theory holds any measurable truth. The mainstream dismiss it as medieval whimsy, but there are enough marginalia notes, particularly among women's convents, that suggest this idea wasn't entirely fringe. You walk with Lucia that evening, joining her slow waddling procession through the field. The geese look unimpressed. One nibbles your hem, another gives you side-eye like it knows what you're planning. Lucia hums as she walks. She points out one bird, Gertrude, she calls her. Very even feathers, cooperative, doesn't honk unnecessarily. You stifle a laugh. She sounds like an ideal roommate. Later, after the geese are ushered back into their pen like unwilling debutantes, you and Lucia sit by the small stream behind the orchard, cleaning the feathers she's gathered. There's a particular technique to stripping the soft down from the shaft, then scraping it smooth with a curved knife. You work quietly, the soft shush of your motions mingling with the burble of water nearby. The moon begins to rise, pale and round like an uncracked egg, casting soft silver across the field. The plucked feathers glint faintly in the light, and for a moment you both fall silent, content in the stillness. Then Lucia speaks again, voice thoughtful. I used to think this work was a punishment. You glance at her, and now, she lifts a feather to the moonlight. Now I think it's a practice, like prayer but with blades, that sits with you for a while, a quiet truth. The next morning, your duties shift. No copying today. You're assigned to the prep room, where parchment is stretched, feathers are carved, and ink is blended. It smells like chalk, lemon balm, and faintly of vinegar, thanks to the tightly sealed jars of iron salts tucked in the corner. You're not alone. Sister Petra is there, assembling ink from gallnuts and rainwater she insists was collected under a morally neutral moon. She hands you a bowl of half-scraped feathers and nods toward the fire. Time to temper. Ah, the fire step. You grip the feather shafts with iron tongs and hover them above the low flames, slowly twisting to heat them evenly. This strengthens the keratin, helps prevent splintering, and slightly hardens the tip for a finer cut. The trick is not to scorch the shaft, unless you want the feather to curl into a crispy apostrophe. One of yours lets out a soft crack. You wince, the rest, thankfully, behave. Then comes the sharpening. You take your time with each quill, slicing the tip at a sharp diagonal, hollowing the center for ink flow, and carving the split that allows for controlled writing. It's meticulous, fiddly work, and yet, deeply satisfying. As you work, Sister Petra tells you about the feather duel that supposedly happened 50 years ago between two scribes in another convent. One accused the other of stealing her best quill. The matter escalated, as things sometimes do, and they challenged each other to a writing contest. First to perfectly copy a psalm without a single blotch won the right to keep both quills. Who won, you ask? No one knows, Petra shrugged. But the manuscript they left behind is still in circulation. You imagine the scene, two determined nuns, jaws clenched, scribbling furiously, while the abbess loomed overhead like a referee. High drama, low stakes, exactly your kind of bedtime Your own feather is now shaped and smooth. You dip it into the test ink, and make a few practice strokes on scrap parchment. The lines are crisp, clean, oddly confident. This one might just be your new favorite. You pause, thinking of Hildegard's feather rating. You give this one a quiet name, Mathilda. She feels sturdy, wise, a little bit sassy at the nib. You write it on a slip of parchment and tuck it into your satchel, like a tiny contract between artist and instrument. Back in the scriptorium, as the bell chimes for mid-morning prayers, you find yourself oddly eager to return to your work, to the page, to the quiet rustle of your new quill brushing against parchment. Because this, you realize, is not just about ink and letters, it's about care, about attention, about taking something as fleeting as a feather and turning it into a vessel for permanence, and maybe, just maybe, about having the best quill in the convent. Not that it's a competition, of course. Mostly, you've never truly seen how much can go wrong with a single quill until the day you're asked to help train the novices. It begins, innocently enough. You're feeling quietly chuffed about your new feather, Mathilda, who is performing like an absolute legend. Your copying has been praised, your ink mix is smooth, and you haven't stabbed your hand in 3 days. Then the abbess appears behind you like a cold breeze, and murmurs, "You will assist in the instruction of Sister Sarah and Sister Adelinde." Ah, training. You shuffle over to the novice table where the 2 young sisters look at you with the enthusiasm of cats being introduced to bathwater. They each hold a quill like it's a question mark, unsure which direction it's supposed to face. Their ink pots are too full, their parchment is stained with thumbprints, and one of them has somehow managed to get a feather stuck behind her ear. "Why do we have to use these?" Sister Sarah mutters, glaring at her quill like it owes her money. "Why not pens?" You take a calming breath. "Well," you begin, "quills are lighter, easier to shape to your writing style, and more importantly, available on legs right outside the convent gates." Sister Adelinde raises her hand. "What if we just copied Heretic," you whisper, just loud enough for them to giggle. Still, it's not a bad question. You find yourself reflecting on it as you guide them through the basics of carving and knitting. Why did so many convents commit so relentlessly to handwritten copies? Even when there were alternatives brewing by the late medieval period, historians still debate the role nuns played in resisting or adapting to early printing methods. While monks are often cited as traditionalists, some evidence suggests that female scriptoria clung to quill work even longer, partly out of pride, and partly out of necessity. The printing press was expensive, loud, and usually found in urban centers, but feathers you could collect in the morning and have writing with by noon. You help Sister Sarah angle her quill properly. She presses too hard and splits the nib. "It's a metaphor for my life," she says. "Your life is 3 inches long and made of keratin." "No, just easily ruined." Tache. After an hour their hands are ink-stained, their parchment filled with irregular loops and nervous slashes, but they're improving. You see it in the way they adjust their grip, in the small nods of satisfaction when a line comes out smooth. It's a slow kind of joy, like coaxing a tune from an unfamiliar instrument. You remember your own training, the agonizing weeks of learning to keep pressure consistent, the sting of wasting parchment, the embarrassment of dripping ink onto a half-finished line. But you also remember the first time a full passage came out perfectly, and the strange feeling of falling in love with an object as ridiculous as a sharpened bird feather. You decide to share one of the old tricks, the candle tip. You hold a quill above a lit candle, not close enough to catch, just enough for the flame to dance. If the nib casts a steady shadow, it's well shaped. If it trembles or splits light strangely, it needs fixing. The novices are enchanted. They start lining up their quills for inspection like aspiring magicians. One fails spectacularly, and Sister Adelinde declares it possessed. You quietly agree. You also take a moment to show them the secret stash, the little shelf behind the ink jars where you and a few others keep emergency feathers. They're all labeled with strange names: Whisper, Storm, Gerald, Pickle. Sister Sarah points to one particularly battered quill and asks why it's even there. You hesitate. "That one's for penance days," you say. They laugh, but later you notice they each place one quill carefully aside, labeling it with a name of their own. Maybe, like you, they're starting to see it not just as a tool but a companion. After the lesson, you're finally back at your own desk. Your fingers sore from guiding clumsy hands, but you feel good, the kind of good that comes from passing on something oddly sacred. Quill work isn't glamorous, it's not fast, but it's intimate. Each stroke is a decision, each line a tiny defiance of time's march. And let's be honest, there's something deeply satisfying about shaping chaos into words, one careful feather at a time. You pick up Mathilda again, give her a little twirl and start a new page. The parchment smells faintly of lemon balm and sheep. Outside you hear the geese honking as they settle in for the night. You wonder which of them will gift you the next perfect feather. You're hoping for Brynhilda. She's a large bird with suspiciously majestic posture. Back on the page, your quill dances, not perfectly, not without the occasional wobble or smudge, but steadily, like memory made visible. There's a ritual you've grown fond of, though no one in the convent would ever call it that out loud. It happens just after lauds, before breakfast, a strange little window of quiet bustle, when the sun barely filters in and everyone's half asleep but entirely present. This is the time when Sister Winifred emerges from the storage cupboard with her enormous sheaf of raw feathers and begins what can only be described as her morning performance. You watch her as you sip your weak nettle tea. She doesn't just sort feathers, she evaluates them, turning each one over like it holds a secret. She lines them up by length, thickness, curve, murmuring things like no spine or too vain, or occasionally just one morning, curiosity gets the better of you. Is there a ranking system? She glances at you over the top of her half-moon spectacles and says, there was. Now you're intrigued. You set down your cup and lean in. Turns out some scriptoriums, particularly those in the Germanic regions, once had formalized quill ranking, not quite Olympic levels of prestige, but a feather's grade determined who could use it and for what task. The highest ranked quills, cut from the outer primaries of young adult geese, were reserved for sacred text only, sermons, scripture and saintly biographies, marginal notes, recipe scribble, chicken inventory logs. Those got the second-tier fluffers, as Winifred calls them. Historians still argue whether these feather rankings were enforced with any real consistency, or whether they were mostly symbolic, a medieval way of making everyone feel just a little more important about their scratches on parchment. Either way, it makes you chuckle to imagine a solemn monk being denied access to a prime quill because his sermon lacked sufficient theological zing. You ask Winifred how she tells them apart. She gives you a look that implies she was born knowing. It's the curve, the grain, the way it sighs when you strip it. That last part sounds suspiciously poetic, but you decide not to press it. You ask if you can help her sort today, and to your surprise she nods. Together you start handling the new arrivals, some still a bit damp from the rainstorm earlier in the week. The smell is earthy, like wet linen and hay. She teaches you to hold each feather by its base and gently press along the shaft to feel for hairline fractures. A good quill will bend slightly without creaking. A bad one snaps or shudders. Like people, she mutters. The most prized feathers are stored in a narrow box lined with lambswool, the sort you might expect to hold jewelry. Winifred opens it with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Inside, the feathers are marked with tiny threads, red for sacred use, blue for scholarly copying, green for musical notation. You hadn't realized music had its own quill class. They like a broader nib, she explains, wider ink flow, less scratch, more swoop. Of course, you notice that a few of the quills bear little ink marks at the tips, test lines perhaps, or signs of prior use. You ask Winifred if they're meant to be retired. She snorts. They're seasoned, like pan. By the end of the hour your fingers are speckled with tiny feather barbs. Your back sore from hunching, but you've gained a new respect for this strange art of pre-writing. You've always thought of quills as disposable, cut, use, toss, but this quiet curation suggests something else, something more ceremonial. Later that day, when you return to your copying bench, you feel oddly sentimental pulling Mathilda from your satchel. You examine her anew. Yes, she's a little more frayed than before. The split in her nib is showing wet, but she's still got a few good pages left in her. And then you do something you've never done before. You kiss the base of the quill, just a quick peck, silly and reverent, an apology, maybe, or a thank you. You doubt Mathilda minds either way. As the day wears on, you begin to notice other small signs that quills aren't just tools to the sisters. Sister Petra has braided a thin red thread around hers. Sister Lucia talks to hers like a garden plant. And Sister Sarah, bless her rebellious heart, has painted tiny eyes on hers, so it can stare down the parchment. This odd feather cult you're now part of has rules, law, even its own gossip. Apparently someone once tried to write an entire prayer book with nothing but crow feather. The result? Smudges, blots, and something Winifred described only as spiritual chaos. You ask if there's ever been a perfect quill. Winifred thinks for a moment. There was one, she says, years ago, snow white, straight as a truth, cut from a goose no one could ever identify. We called it the Saint. What happened to it? She sips her tea. Someone dropped it in a stew pot. You gasp. She said it was an accident, Winifred says, though her tone suggests otherwise. Even now, the story lingers like myth. Some sisters swear the stew that day had a hint of destiny. The rest of your copying that afternoon is smooth, methodical, peaceful. You find yourself falling into rhythm again. Dip, write, breathe, repeat. And you wonder, long after your time here ends, will one of your quills be remembered like that? Not as a relic perhaps, but a whispered name among sisters. A funny little story passed along with a wink and a shrug. Maybe not, but maybe. It's a strange thing to realize that even objects as humble as goose quills can outlive you. You're sitting beside Sister Agnes, one of the oldest nuns in the convent, as she painstakingly transfers the final psalms of a well-loved prayer book into a new binding. Her hands are veined like parchment themselves, and yet every line she lays down is steady, precise, almost defiant. She doesn't waste motion, she doesn't chatter, but when she pauses to sharpen her quill on a block of pumice, she offers you a glance and says, "This one belonged to Sister Elfrida." You blink. Elfrida passed away 5 years ago. You'd never met her, only seen her name written in curling ink at the bottoms of old pages.
She always wrote like she was angry at the parchment, Agnes adds, and you laugh. The feather she holds is speckled grey and bent slightly near the tip, but it's still writing, still serving. Later that evening, you wander to the cabinet where the spare quills are kept, not the everyday ones. Those get turned over fast. These are the odd survivors. Saved, not quite useful, but too good to throw away. You pull open the shallow drawer labelled Retired Friends. Inside it's like a dormitory for tiny, elegant ghosts. There's a little card beside each one, a date, a name, sometimes a brief note, used for Lady Hildegard's funeral rites. Final page of Lent Book 4, broken mid-penance, still love. You hold one in your palm, and feel the faint weight of it, the worn grooves where fingers once gripped. It's like cradling memory. Historians still debate whether these habits, naming quills, saving them, noting their final use, were common in most convents, or peculiar to a few eccentric orders. There's very little documentation, which suggests either it was widespread and unremarkable, or so personal that no one thought to write it down. But standing there, feather in hand, you're convinced this was love, not logistics. You begin to think of your own little flock, Mathilda, Pickle, Juniper, that one crooked monstrosity you named Regret. One by one, they've served their time. Some wore out. Some cracked. One went mysteriously missing after Sister Lucia's suspiciously large ink spill incident. But all of them mattered. You realize something else too. These feathers weren't just about writing. They were about presence. A quill requires attention. You must listen to it. How it glides. How it resists. When it whispers that it needs trimming or rest. You form a relationship with it, and in a life so structured, so filled with silence and repetition, that bond can become unexpectedly dear. That's why Sister Agnes is still using Elfrida's quill, not because it's perfect, but because in some quiet way it's like praying with an old friend. You start to keep a small book of your own, a feather ledger. Every time you retire a quill, you jot down its name, its quirks, and a few lines about what you used it for. Mathilda, stubborn, elegant. Copied the Book of Ruth, blotted on Tuesdays. Juniper, shortest lifespan. Spiteful, excellent for marginalia. You don't tell anyone about this ledger, but you suspect others have their own. Sister Petra hums when she writes with her favorite. Sister Adeline still brings you every broken nib like it deserves a funeral. And maybe it does, because these weren't just tools, they were companions in silence, partners in precision, instruments of praise, and occasionally of muttered curses when they cracked mid-page. You start thinking about what it means to leave something behind, not a big legacy, not a famous manuscript, just evidence of your care. A trail of feathers, maybe. Some smoother than others, all of them pointing, faintly, toward intention. One night after Compline, you sneak down to the storage hall and place your latest retired quill, Regret, may she rest, into the retired friend's drawer. You add a little card, uneven, sassy. Excellent on rough parchment, wrote 3 funeral hymns and 1 biting letter to the bishop. You shut the drawer quietly. No one sees, but you feel oddly lighter. The next morning there's a tiny folded note on your desk. It reads, "I liked Regret, she had bite." Winifred, of course. You smile the whole time you're trimming your new quill. This one's sleek, ivory-colored, almost too pretty. You name her Eulalia, and in that moment, surrounded by ink pots, warm sunlight and faint goose chatter in the distance, you realize something else. You've become one of them, the keepers of feathers, the whisperers of ink, the quiet scribes who fall in love with flimsy little things that somehow carry entire worlds. You know it's gotten serious when you start having feather dreams. Last night in the half-lucid fog between Compline and dawn, you dreamt you were flying, no wings, no broom, just gliding gently over the convent garden. You looked down and realized you were being carried by a giant goose quill. It whispered scripture as you drifted, and every breath of air smelled like ink and lavender. You wake up laughing softly to yourself, tangled in scratchy wool blankets, but the image lingers. Maybe it's time to admit it. You are officially obsessed with Goose Quill. Fortunately, you're not alone. Sister Lucia has now started what she calls Quill Club. Although the prioress insists it's just quiet study with feather maintenance, you meet once a week in a corner of the cloister garden, with tea and tiny fire. Everyone brings their latest quill child and shares tips, stories, and when Winifred allows low-stakes quill swapping. Today you're trying out Sister Sierra's newest find, a particularly bendy quill from a grey-laced Toulouse Goose. Its curve is exquisite, and though it has a bit of a wobble when you try to draw loops, it feels like writing with silk ribbon. You name it temporarily Daphne. Someone suggests engraving initials at the base of each quill for posterity. Someone else proposes composing haikus about your favorite ones. By the end of the hour, someone has written a small anthem complete with lute chords titled "O Feather, Friend and Flame." You're only half joking. This isn't just hobbyist behavior, it's a subculture, a weird, wonderful, ink-smeared subculture of women who worship at the altar of avian appendages. Historians still debate the degree to which medieval women in religious orders expressed creative individuality through their scriptorium tool. Some believe there was more conformity than freedom, especially in stricter Benedictine convents. Others argue these quiet personalizations, names, charms, tiny poems, were the very soul of daily joy. You don't need a historian to tell you, you're living it. The most surprising part, though, isn't the community or the craftsmanship. It's how the act of writing itself has changed. You used to see transcription as a duty, a slow, wrist-aching, back-hunching part of monastic life, but now it feels like a duet. You and the quill dancing across vellum, sometimes in harmony, sometimes with squabbles. When the nib catches, you pause, breathe, adjust. When the flow of ink is perfect, you almost hear music. There's something meditative about it too. You start losing track of hours while copying. You memorize whole passages by accident. Your hands grow more confident. You no longer fear trimming the nib yourself. You even help the novices when their quills go rogue and bleed ink like nervous apprentices at first confession. One evening, while the rest of the convent is busy harvesting turnips, you slip into the scriptorium early and light a single beeswax candle. The smell is soft and golden, the silence, velvety. You sit down, pull out eulalia, and begin writing not scripture, not a commission, just a line that's been in your head all week. The hand forgets itself, but the feather remembers. You don't know if it's poetry or madness, but it feels true. As the sun slips lower behind the chapel tower, you lean back and admire your page. The lines glisten for a moment in the candlelight, then dry into permanence. Your mind wanders, as it often does now, to where these quills came from. Not just the birds, though that's part of it, but the journey, from fields to feathers, from feathers to hands, from hands to words, and somehow from words back to the spirit again. You wonder if one day, centuries from now, someone will stumble upon your scribbles and marvel at the ink, the script, the feather pressed into the margin. You wonder if they'll smell faint hints of beeswax and lavender, or imagine the flicker of your candle, or maybe, just maybe, they'll remember eulalia. You never planned on becoming the convent's unofficial feather supplier, it just happened. One moment you were gently collecting shed goose feathers from the herb garden like a sentimental amateur. The next, sisters were knocking on your door at dawn, with hopeful eyes and a soft whispered, "Do you have anything curly?" It turns out not everyone likes doing their own trimming. Some sisters can't tell a good shaft from a brittle one, and a few don't even know the difference between a primary and secondary feather. Shocking, really. You start giving informal lessons on Tuesdays. Quill 101. You use chalk to draw diagrams on the cloister wall. You make little rhyme songs like thicker shaft, longer draft, thinner spine, break in time. It's extremely nerdy. Everyone loves it. The goose population, however, is getting wise. Sister Marguerite swears the birds are starting to hide their best feather. One particularly smug gander has developed a habit of strutting near the scriptorium windows just to show off his glorious left wing, only to flap off the moment anyone approaches with a basket. In response, you develop stealth strategies, feather patrols at dawn, coded hand signal, a goose bribe fund of extra kitchen scraps. One novice even tries to disguise herself as a shrub. Historians still argue whether this kind of elaborate feather foraging ritual was common among scriptorium nuns, or just the byproduct of too much cloister time. The official records are understandably silent, but marginalia, those scribbled, whispered notes in the corners of old manuscripts, sometimes include drawings of nuns chasing poultry or muttering about the good quill that got away. You feel a deep kinship with those. Eventually, Sister Winifred comes up with the idea for the quill census. Once a month you meet to take stock. How many new feathers collected? How many trimmed? How many retired? A formal logbook is started. There's a chart. There are color-coded ribbons. You think just for a moment that you may have created a small feather-based bureaucracy, but it's a beautiful one. And somehow this system makes everyone more mindful.
quills become not just tools but a shared ritual. Every feather that shaped and passed along holds a memory of the hands that preened it, the prayers whispered over it, the parchment it touched. Then comes the scandal. One stormy night, Sister Petra announces she has discovered a cache of swan feathers hidden beneath the altar linen. Everyone gasps. Swan feathers are technically banned. They're too thick, too showy, and the abbess once called them the vanity project of penitent peacocks. But Petra claims one is perfect. She passes it around during Quill Club. It is, you must admit, exquisite. Long, shimmering white, with just the right curve. The kind of feather that writes poetry without trying. You call it the Duchess. There is a secret vote. It is decided informally and under extreme secrecy that the Duchess will be given one project, the copying of a special feast day hymn. It's glorious. You use it in the early hours of the morning, when the chapel is still cloaked in blue-black shadows, and the frost makes everything quiet. The lines flow like water, the words gleam. You forget your fingers, you forget your worries. You are nothing but breath, ink and prayer. And then, because you're a responsible scribe, you retire. The Duchess. You don't press your luck. You place her in the retired friends drawer in a little cloth pouch. You write on her card, brief, forbidden, unforgettable. You think she'd approve. Your love for these feathers has reached a kind of spiritual height. You've stopped seeing them as quaint tools from a dusty past. They are now small conduits of grace, bridges between Goose and God. It's absurd. It's beautiful. You adore it. One day, as you sit in the sunlit cloister, shaping a particularly rebellious quill with a sliver of bone, Sister Agnes sits beside you without a word. She watches you for a long moment, then says, "You know you've turned this into something sacred." You shrug, bashful. "It's just a feather." She smiles. "So's an angel's wing." You let that sit in the silence between you, warm and weightless. The wind rustles through the nearby coop. Somewhere a goose honks indignantly. You think maybe it's the one that laid the Dutch. You nod your thanks to it anyway, because even absurd obsessions, when tended with care, shared in community and rooted in love, can become holy, even if they start with a goose. You notice it first in the way the ink flows, not faster, not neater, just gentle. Your newest quill glides over parchment as if it's humming to itself, quietly content. It doesn't snag, doesn't sputter. It feels like your fingers in the feather have finally struck an unspoken truce. After all these months, maybe years, you've stopped wrestling with your tool. You're simply writing. The word mastery doesn't quite fit. It's softer than that, more like friendship. This one's called Imelda. You trimmed her yourself, shaped the nib just so with your favorite pumice stone, and rubbed her gently with a cloth that still smells faintly of rose oil. You're copying a text on Hildegard of Bingen today. Appropriate, you think, given how often Hildegard wrote about divine order in the natural world. There's something divine about quills too, not because they're grand or dramatic, just the opposite, because they're humble, ephemeral, the writing equivalent of candlelight. You pause and glance around the scriptorium. Sister Lucia is dozing slightly in the corner, quill in hand, still upright. Sister Winifred is murmuring a verse to herself as she writes, tapping the rhythm on the desk like a metronome. Outside the window, geese waddle in a lazy V formation, as if they too are bound by ancient rules of grace. You smile. This quiet world you've built, ink and feathers, books and candles, secret songs and sly jokes about poultry, has become a kind of sanctuary within a sanctuary. Historians might one day argue over how seriously medieval nuns took their craft, how much joy they found in small things. Some will say it was all about duty and doctrine. Others will point to the surviving manuscripts with dancing marginalia, to feathers carved with initials and prayers, and see women who poured their souls into every page. You hope it's the latter. You know it is. Tonight is the feast of St. Catherine, patron of scribes. The scriptorium has been swept and fresh rushes laid down. You've helped arrange a special display of your community's finest quills, from Eulalia and the Duchess to one newer favorite nicknamed the Quiet One. Narrow nib, sharp thinker. Each quill sits atop a folded scrap of vellum, bearing its name and service dates, like a tiny feathered obituary. It's adorable, slightly ridiculous, perfect. The abbess even allows an hour of shared storytelling. One sister recalls when a goose stole her entire inkpot mid-transcription. Another claims her quill once predicted the weather by curling at the tip. You're not sure whether to believe that one, but you nod solemnly. You tell the tale of your first quill, the one you broke in half. You remember how frustrated you were, how clumsy and and then how slowly, across long days and even longer nights, you learned. You loved something into life. The bell rings for compline. You all rise, stretch aching backs and carry your candles toward the chapel. Shadows sway against the stone as you walk. It smells like wax and sandalwood. You feel the hush settle around you like a warm shawl. Later, before sleep, you take one last look at your desk. There's Imelda, lying neatly beside the ink pot. A few curled shavings from today's trimming still cling to the edge of your blot. A tiny feather rests in the windowsill. A gift from the wind maybe. You pick it up, smile, and whisper a promise. I'll find a use for you. You probably will, because this isn't just about nuns and geese. It never was. It's about finding beauty in slow things, in quiet ritual, in small obsessions that tether us to meaning when the world feels too fast, too loud, too much. It's about letting yourself care deeply, even about something as silly as a feather, especially about something as silly as a feather, because when you give care, you receive it back in comfort, in laughter, in community, and in the soft, persistent rustle of wings. And now, with everything in its place, quills stored, candles low, dreams beginning to drift like ink across the edge of sleep, you let yourself rest. You did good work. The geese would be proud. Wind down 300 words. Let your breath slow now. Just a little. You've earned it after all that trimming, dipping, scratching, laughing, and whispering with the geese. Your hands can finally rest, still remembering the shape of the feather, the weight of the page, the pull of the words. There's no more writing tonight, no need to sharpen or check the ink. The scriptorium is dark, the convent silent, and somewhere nearby, a goose nestles into straw, shedding one perfect feather that will wait patiently for dawn. Let your thoughts wander gently over the memories of soft parchment beneath your palm, of candlelight flickering over ink lines, of the quiet companionship of sisters who know that joy can be found in the tiniest of things. You are safe here, you are warm, you are surrounded by soft murmurs and distant rustles. Let them carry you now, like that giant quill in your dream, just floating, not flying, exactly, but drifting gently downward toward dreams written in feather script, the kind you don't need to read to understand. Close your eyes, the world can wait. For now there's just the slow hush of sleep, and the quiet promise that when you wake, the geese will still be there, waddling, honking, and leaving gifts, soft gifts, feathered gifts, dreams waiting to be written.